they were
So,
not good at risk management.
last time we talked a lot about more in depth on positioning, and then we talked about how we have to dig even more into the competitor to understand if maybe they've got an entire spectrum of product lines, in which case our job as the startup company delivering a new product becomes a little bit harder, right? And we have to figure out maybe how we can position ourselves, and that might require some either horizontal or vertical market positioning. And we, of course, had the example of Honda and lifestyle marketing, where you no longer position purely based on price, but on more of an aspirational goal. We talked a little bit about substitutes and how oftentimes we can be at odds with substitutes, and as a result, we've really got to think about how we're going to do a better job of benefiting the end user rather than these substitutes. And then finally concluded with the last two, secondary markets and point tools, right? So once again, we said secondary markets are similar to having a complete product line. If your competitor owns a secondary market, then it makes it even harder for people to then be able to move in and offer a lower price product. Could you close the door? And then this idea of a point tool versus an integrated solution, right? Can you be a really great point tool rather than being a complete solution when you get started? And what was the one thing that we mentioned that might happen if we decide to integrate with a third-party vendor? I mentioned a few things.
You're dependent on them.
Right.
So that could be bad if something's going on.
Sure. So how do we hedge against them? Yeah. Go ahead, Andrew.
I mean, you gave a couple examples of where the one that you integrate with dies or doesn't do very well, and then you're sunk with it. So
right.
I guess you talked about how you could start by integrating, but then you should probably move away.
Yep. And
or integrate with multiple.
Yeah. How would you start moving away?
Go in your own.
Okay. Good. Yep. So you might want to go down this integrated solutions path, but you've always got to be careful about doing business with third-party vendors. And then we started to talk a little bit about customer discovery, and today we're going to dig in deeper into customer discovery, and this will be the period where things get a little bit more interesting because this is certainly going to fit in with your lab assignments, and it also is going to be the time in which you've got to start reaching out to people to hear their feedback on your idea. And for the next few weeks, we'll start moving more into actually building with the product development. So quiz 1 results should be coming out soon. Does anybody have questions on Lab 2? Hopefully you've all gotten started. Yes, Rob.
So what it says on the syllabus is so it's the second week of October, correct?
Correct.
Sorry.
Yes. The Lab 2. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay, well, you hopefully have some partners that can help. And let me know so we can schedule a makeup.
For assignment 3 on the lab, it said something about create personas.
Yep.
What is that?
We're going to dig into that today.
Okay.
So you should be in a good position. If you've done the first 2 assignments, then today's lecture will help you with the 3rd assignment. Anything else? Okay, and hopefully your readings will also help. So I think this week's readings begin on mental models, and Indy Young, the author, digs into that in greater detail as well. Okay, any other questions on Lab 2? Okay. Once again, general announcement. So for all of you who are, which should be 100%, applying for the Duke Startup Challenge, we are going to try to have some form of office hours in the Duke Hatch on October 23rd, so that's a week before. I'll probably put a sign-up sheet so that you can come in and cut to the front of the line and I can look at your idea summary. If you just do a walk-in, then depending on how many students are there, I might or may not be able to look at your idea summary. We're also going to open it up to students in Fuqua and sort of all over, so keep that in mind. But obviously you have first knowledge of it, so you should be able to sign up, and I'll post a link to that later this week. Does anybody have any questions on this? Okay. Okay, so for today, we're going to dig in a little bit more into customer discovery, because I know a lot of you have asked, how do we reach out to customers? How do we figure out who our customers are? How do we get those early adopters? And we're going to talk about what it means to make a mental model of a customer and how that's going to actually help you then determine what it is that you need to build in terms of the actual implementation of your product. And then we'll also give you some guidance into how to conduct customer interviews, because a lot of times people are like, I don't even know how to begin asking the right questions. So we'll tackle all three today. So this is still the phase where we're not building anything yet, right? Now we're getting to the phase where we might have a hypothesis on who our early adopters are, and we want to get out and see, are we correct, or are there multiple segments of people that we need to be going after? So the one thing I want to bring up is too often people have this myth of the omniscient founder where they think, oh, Steve Jobs and all these guys are so brilliant, and ladies are so brilliant. And unfortunately, I'm not as brilliant and I don't know what a customer wants. But they seem to know what people want, right? And the truth is that this is oftentimes a myth that gets perpetuated because the truth is that they spend many, many years, sometimes decades, really understanding the market, really understanding the technology, and then finally really knowing the customer. Oftentimes they are the customer, right? And so out of this, they're then able to say, here's what a product should be like, and then we all think of them as brilliant. So realize that there are a number of hours that go into developing this level of expertise, and I've marked some supplemental reading here. It's not part of your general reading. But the Steve Jobs Way is a great book that talks a lot about how Apple in particular thinks about doing its product innovation and how systematic it is in its approach and how it's taken many, many years, even decades to perfect this process. So I put this chart up last time, I'll put it up again. We talked about basically we're moving away from market research where we picked out what our user segments were, and now we're moving into customer discovery and validation. And a lot of that is going to then help us determine who our early adopter is, what's an appropriate pricing strategy, how we want to do distribution, and then finally it will end with, what sort of product do we want to implement, or at least what's the prototype going to be, what's the problem that it's solving for customers. So to begin, we've got to start testing across various user segments, right? We've got a few that we've picked out in mind based on market research, based on talking to people, based on just our general gut instinct, right? Hopefully we've done some competitive analysis, so there is a little bit more than intuition, but we might be wondering which segment is the right one to go after. And so there's this concept called a mental model. Has anybody already heard of this? Okay, Walter?
Yeah, I've read some of that.
Oh, you read some of the book. Okay.
Will you just describe what an early adopter would be like their characteristics?
Okay. Anything more than just the characteristics?
So you look at the process a little more holistically, so you really define what the steps are someone goes throughout that entire experience and sort of think about what you could create that would fit within that.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, the mental model of an early adopter is they're going to have some experience. It could be a problem. It could be as simple as the one that Indy gives in the book, which is going to the movies, right, and all the different interactions they're having as they go through this experience. But really, what a mental model is that it's going to give you a deep set of understanding about people's motivations, some of their cultural nuances and expectations, some of their emotional experiences. And all of this then gives you a good model of who that early adopter is going to be, right? So it's sort of this culmination of a personality. It is not just a demographic like we've talked about before when we talked about market research. And the reason that we want to go down this path is because this is actually what fundamentally builds a lot of that brand loyalty that we've been talking about. And that's really crucial for an early adopter, right? We want them to go out and be evangelists. So we've got to get into the mindset of these early adopters, and the way to do that is to create a mental model. Now, the other thing is we have to create a mental model per each segment. So it's not enough to just say, here's the problem, and we think it's affecting, women at Duke, right? We might even have to divide it even further and say, oh, this is for the freshman women, or this is for the senior women, right? And really get into what are some beliefs that they hold, or what are some of, what's the emotional context that they're in. Now, the reason that we go through all of this is because once we understand the mental model and what the differences are, it's actually going to feed back into the design and the implementation of the product itself. And this is why it's really critical to not start building before you've developed your mental model, right? Because what if somebody comes to you, in your user segment, or a bunch of people come and say, well, I don't actually like using, iPhone, I prefer Android, right? And you've invested all this time into building an iOS app. Really doesn't make sense to do that. So this is why it's important to develop a mental model where you can then decide how you want to later go on and implement your product. So the other few things that the mental models are going to do in terms of benefits is, the first is that it's going to give you confidence in terms of your design, right? How is it that you're thinking about the product and the solution, right? And oftentimes it's the solution and less about the product itself and what it looks like. The other is it's going to give you some clarity in your decision, right? Because once you have a sense of here's the person, here's what they're experiencing, and do they actually have a problem, then yeah, it makes sense to actually build a business around this problem, right? Until you do that, you're just looking at market data and assuming that people are going to want to buy this product. So this is another reason that you need to have a mental model. And then the final is that it's going to give you a little bit more of a long-term strategy, meaning once you really understand your users, you can then anticipate what their needs might be in the future, right? So coming back to that myth of the omniscient founder, this is why people are able to build products that almost anticipate the needs of their customers, because they have a really deep understanding of the mental model of their customers. So, after saying all this, how do you even know that the design is going to be right, that it's going to be appealing to people? Well, you've got to start by doing some research, right? And I don't mean jumping into doing the interviews yet. That's one part of the research. But for example, here's a case study of Disney Hall, and Frank Gehry was designing Disney Hall. And the thing is, he didn't just think about the hall as a space. He actually took a little bit of a step back and thought about it as an experience. And as an experience, he identified that there's actually a number of people that were going to be in this hall. There's the conductor, there's the musician, and then finally there are the people that are actually listening to the music. And so what he had to do was work with each of these user segments. So for example, he had to work with an acoustician, and with the acoustician, he had to talk about how do we make a really big sound really big, and how do we make a small sound really small. And then through this, he was able to create the dynamics of the room to highlight, the music. So really, it's not just about the hall itself and the end, user being the customer. It's all three of these people, and you really took the time in designing this to think about the experience. So just an example of a case study of how you want to think about the experience. You don't want to just think about it as like, oh, this is a space and the music's going to sound great, right? It gets even more nuanced than that. So you really want to be thinking about the whole experience. Now, the other part of thinking about the whole experience, and I've mentioned this a few times before, is that it's not just enough to think about how is the customer going to interact with this particular product or this particular tool, right? You want to think about everything. This comes back to what we talked about positioning, right? It really matters not just what your product does, but how it's promoted, how we distribute it, and what the pricing strategy is. So it's not enough to just say, hey, we sell this solution. You've got to think about it a little bit more holistically. So once again, creating a mental model and understanding how people feel about the experience and how they're going through it is going to feed into that. So basically, what the mental models are trying to do is it's trying to capture this cognitive intent and emotional, social environment, and cultural traits and concepts, right? So this is like a really great definition. What does all this mean, right? This is what it means. It means that, there's a hipster, and this is the picture I think that depicts it the best. So there's a hipster, right? And basically the iPhone and the iPad, to a lot of people, when it came out, seemed like the same thing. I know, my parents were like, it's just a bigger screen, right? But to this guy, no. Two different products, right? The iPad does so much more. It's a content consumption device, and the iPhone, is basically on-the-go device that you can use for a number of things, but you wouldn't dare, use Flipboard on an iPhone. You'd use it on an iPad. So the reason I bring this up is because, this hipster has some cultural traits, right? Some social, environmental factors that are impacting the way that he perceives these products, right? So it kind of has to come back to that. And Apple has obviously done a really great job of marketing to this individual by understanding these nuances, okay? So I want you to think about, this guy as you're thinking about your product and who might that person be in your case, right? And yes, it seems a little bit weird, a little bit extreme, but this perfectly captures an early adopter for an Apple product. Now, when we're going through this exercise of creating mental models, there's both science and intuition that we combine. So it's not all just about, oh, I think this is what people want, and it's not all just about, let's go out and do some field research. You're going to bridge the two, and hopefully in bridging those two, you'll be able to figure out what you should convey in terms of the product's information, right? So you wouldn't want to tell this guy too much about just pure specs. You might want to know some additional factors. So the purpose of mental models is, of course, first to validate the idea that you've got and to match them to the needs of the customer. And then, like I said before, you're going to capture what the cognitive intent is of somebody making the purchase, what their emotional intent is in using this product, and then if there are any social or cultural traits that really manifest themselves into the product that you're building, right? We saw this last week as well with the example with the Honda and the Harley, right? There's clearly some different traits between a person that's driving the Honda versus the person that's driving the Harley, and they were really able to capture both, with their tagline of, you meet the nicest people on a Honda. So the other thing, which I know you all brought up, was that this is actually going to further your business. So in going down this path of taking a holistic approach, not just thinking about the product, but thinking about the positioning and the entire experience, you're actually doing what's known as an experience strategy. So you're combining the business aspects along with the product and the experience people are going to have. And if you want to learn more, you can look at this guy, Jesse James Garrett. He's sort of the pioneer in this whole field of experience strategy. Okay, so now we dig into how do we actually create a mental model, right? We want to go through this. We want to do it for our user segments. You got to do it for the lab. So the first is we need to learn the verbs of a customer. And by verbs, I mean you might have some experience that you were thinking of building a product for, but you need to know what it is that these customers do. Not just in relation to the solution that you're offering, but based on the entire experience that they're undergoing. And I'll give you some examples to make it a little more concrete. So the simplest example that comes to my mind is when I was doing this for VisiBee, is there's a yoga studio owner, right? And they have a number of verbs, meaning a number of things that they're going to be doing in the course of a day. So they might teach classes, they might take attendance, they might schedule instructors, collect money from customers, and they might do some stuff on the back office like accounting and bookkeeping and taxes and all of this stuff, right? So I need to know everything that a potential yoga studio owner does, not because I'm going to incorporate everything into my product, but I just want to know, what's of greater or lesser frequency and how they feel about all of these tasks that they're doing. Might have another user segment, might have an instructor, right? Not a studio owner, but just an instructor. And they might have some differences. They might teach classes just one-on-one. They might not teach, student classes. They might teach at a corporation versus just a studio. They might teach full-time versus part-time, right? And a lot of times they're traveling around to teach, which then means that they probably have some different needs than the studio owner. So I want to capture all of these verbs, all of these actions that an owner versus an instructor is doing in the course of their day. And then from here, I can actually go on to create some personas. Okay, so you asked the question, how do we create a persona? So a persona is basically a user profile. Okay, and it's going to help us then use that profile in other departments. So it's not just that as engineers we're going to take this profile and then we're going to build products for our end users, but we're also going to take that same user profile, and because we're going down an experience strategy where we're doing both business and user experience, right? We're going to convey this persona to sales and to marketing so that they have an understanding of who it is that we're going after as well. Okay, and this is really important because in your groups you might have some people that are doing sales versus engineering, but everybody needs to know because everyone is involved in servicing the customer on some level. So the way that persona is going to benefit other teams is it helps marketing develop a position, right? When they understand who the user is or what the user profile is, right, they can develop a position. So, for example, Honda was able to develop a position saying, you meet the nicest people, because they knew that the people they were going after were not those that were driving Harleys, very different user segments. Then, same thing, you can convey this information to sales, right? So how is the product going to benefit these people? They're going to be doing sales calls. They're going to be wanting to let the end user know what the benefits are. And then finally, there's, of course, the engineering team that needs to understand that they're not building this product for themselves, right? That they're building it for someone else, and so they have to think like that other user. So it's kind of like acting where people get into character. As an engineer, you're going to get into character, and that character is going to be your user. And so you have to put that hat on when you're thinking about what the product experience is going to be like. So now when we think about how do we actually go through and create these personas, okay, we're going to start by focusing on end goals and life goals. Okay? So I know this is kind of weird, but when we talk to our customers and we ask them why are they doing the verbs that they're doing, right? We need to understand what is it that they're trying to accomplish. So why would a yoga studio owner take attendance? Well, because they want to know who's coming in regularly. They might decide, hey, I need to know who's going to expire so that I can get them to come back and pay me more money so I can stay in business, right? So there might be some goals that they're trying to accomplish. And the other thing is, why do they want to accomplish this goal, right? Are they not only looking to stay in business, but are they looking to build their business? So it's important to ask these questions as follow-ups to the verbs themselves. And then from there, we can create these user segments. These are going to be different from the market segments that we created, right? And these are going to be more like task-based segments. So I'll get into what that means in a couple of slides. But the key thing is, like I said, you're going to avoid these traditional market segments because now you're not interested in going after demographics. You're interested in going after the nuances, and those nuances being the cultural and social traits of this person. And the way to do that is to understand their behaviors, why they're doing something, and what's the end goal. Does this make sense? I know it can be a little abstract. So when you're thinking about this, the way to eliminate those traditional market segments, you use them initially to kind of explore a hypothesis, but then you get rid of them. So when you start to get rid of them, you have to think about what are the distinguishing behaviors. So in my case, what is so different from a yoga instructor versus a studio owner, right? Well, we listed a number of the tasks that each group was doing, right? So similarly for you guys, you might have a number of user segments, and it's important to understand what each of those segments is doing just a little bit differently. Okay? And then you're going to want to group these behaviors into the segments, right? So Duke freshman women might have a certain set of characteristics that are different from Duke sophomore guys, and you want to identify what those traits are, not just that one is a woman and one is a guy, right? You've got to get into sort of the deeper cultural and social implications. So each segment that you're going to go after, right, if you decide you're going to do multiple, you need to understand the needs of each of them. So it's not enough to just say, well, these are all good students and they probably all want jobs, so we need to design some things to get them all jobs. Right? We're going to try to dig in a little bit deeper. Not trying to pinpoint anybody here, just first example that came to mind. So determining these needs is then going to help with the design. Okay? It's going to help with the design in the sense of how you actually create the product, what it looks like, and how someone will interact with it. But, like I said, we need to do some level of research, so we're going to start by doing some user research. And we're going to do, there's a few different types of user research that we can do. So to begin with, in this phase, we're going to do the first, where we're going to think about preferences of customers. And so to do that, I'm going to give you some examples of how you can conduct preference interviews. And then next week when we talk a little bit, or actually maybe the next lecture, when we talk a little bit more about usability testing, then we'll talk about that next technique. Now, the difference between these two techniques is when you're doing the preference interview, okay, the reason that you're doing it is because you're trying to, once again, get an understanding of who this customer is. You can relate that information back to marketing so that they can go off and do a marketing campaign or a branding campaign. Okay? You can also take that feedback and use it for building an initial prototype. But you're going to want to do a follow-up interview. You're going to want to do a usability test because then you need to understand if what it is that you designed matches up with, the persona that you had created, right? So does the interaction match up with what somebody would want? So to give you a simple example, the way that I did this with BusyBee was I first went out and conducted my interviews with the owners and the instructors, and then put out a prototype to both of them, and did the usability test. And what was interesting is that the people who had been in business for a very long time, 20, 30 years, who weren't necessarily tech savvy, had a very, very different level of usability test than those who were just very, very young and accustomed to technology. So it was important to go through, not just do the initial customer interview, but to also do the usability test.
How do you go about usability testing when you haven't been building anything?
We'll get to that. Yeah, you are going to build something soon. But yeah, we'll get to that. Okay? So these are the two techniques. We're not going to dig into this too much because you guys aren't there yet in terms of your product, but we'll talk about the first two techniques. So before we dig in, we have to set some goals of what it is we want to do when we do the customer discovery. Okay? And the goals being, do we want to identify personas? Do we want to identify who the early adopters are? Do we want to validate that they actually care about our idea? So these are all things to think about as we are coming up with our interview questions. And what we're going to do is, once we have the interview questions, we can then collect the feedback and categorize all of the customers. And what you might find is there might even be some nuances. So in my case, there were studio owners who were part of franchises where they had a lot of business coming in. And they had a different set of needs compared to those who were independent, mom and pop shops. Similarly, I had yoga instructors who were on the go or teaching part-time, and they had a very different set of needs compared to people that were teaching full-time at a studio or on their own. Okay, so pointed that out. And the key, though, is the reason you're conducting these interviews, remember I said it comes back to the design of your product. So you need to understand what needs are the same and what needs might be completely different. Why do you think you might need to do that?
Because if the needs are in stark contrast with each other, you're going to end up losing one of the groups if you build it just that particular feature.
Sure. Right. And you want to be designing, at least initially, for a common case. So basically, the results from the interview will point out what the common cases are. So you might be able to get both groups, or if they're so in opposition, then you might decide, hey, we can't build a general solution to meet most of these needs. We might just have to exclude one of the groups. So is this making sense why you need to do the interviews and how that feeds back into the design of your product? Okay. So when we talk about doing an interview, right, how do we do an interview? So the first thing you've got to decide is, well, how many people do we want to interview in each of the segments? What seems reasonable. It's not that you need to do 50 or 100. That is actually a good number, depending on what your product is and how competitive the market is. But for the purposes of your lab, I think I said do one interview per person in your group. And then you can still go down the path of selecting demographics. You can start there, because that'll give you at least a start as to who the customer might be, and you can refine it from there. But then the third thing you're going to need to do is come up with a qualification questionnaire. Does anybody know what a qualification questionnaire is? Okay. So sometimes you go and interview somebody only to find out that they are the last person on earth that you would want as an early adopter. Okay, and so you don't want to waste your time doing a full interview with them, doing a usability test, only to discover that they either didn't have a problem that you're trying to solve for, or they're just not interested in your product. So you come up with a qualification questionnaire, which is usually like 3 to 5 questions, very short. Sometimes you can just email them to people or get on the phone, but this isn't the time to invest a lot of time in an interview. It's just, hey, this person seems like, yeah, we want to spend more time and they're interested in the product and what we're doing, or no, this person, we don't want to waste any more time. So it's important to come up with a qualification questionnaire. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, the other thing about the qualification questionnaire is if there are certain things in your solution that you think you're looking for, right, and you absolutely need in an early adopter, then you've got to include those in that questionnaire. Okay? So, if, for example, your question is, hey, are you a Duke sophomore girl? And if they're not, okay, well then, moving right along, right? Don't target the people that aren't, because it will not be beneficial for you to continue with the interview process. The other thing that you want to do is in this qualification questionnaire, it'll help you determine their interests and whether or not they're capable of carrying on a longer conversation. Because the next round of the interview that you're going to do is going to be anywhere from 15 to 60 minutes long. And so you want someone who will actually dedicate the time and give you appropriate results, right? You don't just want someone who's going to conduct one of those like psych studies and you pay them $10. Like, that's not the point here. The point is that they will eventually adopt your product. And then, of course, schedule times with them and make sure you make a list of the people that are qualified. Now, there are 6 rules that we need to follow when we're conducting these interviews so that we get the best results from the customers that we're interviewing. And the first is that we don't actually talk about product preferences. So if you're building an iPhone app, you're not going to ask them, do you use an iPhone? Right? Instead, you're going to try to allude to, what do you use for communication? Why do you use this? And what's your preferred method of communication, right? So getting at triangulation in order to get the product preference out rather than just coming out and saying it. Why do you assume we want to do it this way? What do you think happens if we just came out and asked them the question directly?
They'll be a lot more positively responsive if you skew it in that direction.
Okay, sure. What else?
And then I get like a yes or no question, which you may want to build off of that question with other things. That might just make it kind of end the conversation pretty fast.
Right, and then what would that do if you ended the conversation quickly?
Wouldn't give you anything to build off of.
Right. Right. So what if you were to say, what do you use to communicate with your mom? And they were like, oh, I use my landline at home. Then you're like, oh, why do you use a landline? Right? It might just be something like that. It might give you a sense of what their preferences are, rather than if you ask them, do you use an iPhone? And they're like, no. And you're like, okay, well, great. Right? So keeping the questions a little bit more open-ended helps you to figure out what their behaviors are, right? Or they might say something like, well, I usually use an iPhone to talk to all my friends, but when I'm talking to my parents, they don't like it when I drop calls or whatever, so I got to get on the landline, right? So this will exhibit some behaviors. You want to ask questions that are going to exhibit behaviors, not just give you a clear-cut answer. So only ask open-ended questions. The other thing that's important is to not use any words of your own, right? A lot of times people do this because they're trying to make them feel comfortable, but you don't want to get in there and be like, I love Android. What do you think about it, right? Why do you think you would want to do that? Why wouldn't you want to use words of your own?
Because it skews our response.
Yeah, exactly. It skews the response, and it kind of takes them off track, and then they might get into a heated argument, and that's not the purpose of this conversation. And then sometimes you just want to let them go off on some tangents, right? So give yourself enough time to do that. But like I said, don't have it be about particular tools. Have it be about behaviors and philosophies. And if you read the text, Indy does a good job of giving you an example of how she does it that is in a nice flow. And then the 6th is immediate experience. So by immediate experience, I think I don't remember why I put that up there. I think what we're referring to is, do they have an immediate problem today that you're trying to solve? Okay. So we talked a little bit about this already, right? To elicit more information, we have to ask open-ended questions. We don't want to bias answers, and we want them to, answer directly. So we might say things like, "Tell me more," right? Or, "Why is it that you talk to your parents on a landline? Where do your parents live?" Get some more social, cultural, environmental influences out by asking them to tell you more. So, just some examples, how did you do that? How did you actually get that information? Is that one of the things that you're doing right now? How do you keep up to date with the latest products? Not necessarily asking them what the products are, but how do you keep up to date? And they might say, "Oh, I read Wired, or I read Hacker News, or I read Fortune." And then you start to get, "Oh, well, that's where they're hanging out," right? So now you've got some ideas for how you can market to them. And then, get them to give you some examples as well of why things have worked or haven't worked the way that they've wanted. So the key really is to find out as much as you can about a customer, right? It's not to come in and say, "Hey, do you have this problem? Because I've got a solution that I'm building for it." And too often people do that, and it's really not even worth your time, because at that point you're basically just doing a sales pitch, right? And right here, we're not selling. We don't have anything to sell because we haven't built anything, right? So it should be easy to go in and have a conversation. The other thing is, this is also, once again, validating whether or not what we want to build actually makes sense. So in the online course I teach, I had a student who was really, really gung-ho about building this solution for private physicians. And what she wanted to do was build a way for customers to be sent a memo or an email saying, "Hey, you haven't visited in a while, you need to get back to your physician and get your 6-month or your annual checkup." And she went to the physicians and said, "So, do you have this problem where customers come in and then they don't come for a while? And is that a big problem?" And at first she was really reluctant to do the interview, right? She's like, "No, I think this is a big problem." And I said, "Well, for the purpose of this class, just go out and do the interview. Do the interview with one physician, just for me." I was like, "Okay, fine, I'll do it." So she went out to Chicago, where she was living, and she had one interview. What do you think happened? Well, she didn't have a solution, right? She was just exploring this as an option, right? So she went in and asked just a general question of, "Do you have this problem?" Right? She didn't have anything built. What do you think the physician said?
They use it for the tuition.
No.
That's not really a problem.
Exactly. It's not really a problem. In fact, the problem that the physicians had wasn't getting more customers to come in. It was to get all the customers that are coming to pay on time. So he was like, "I don't need more customers. What I need is the people who are already coming in to pay me." And this actually helped her to refocus on what she thought the biggest problem was, and to create her prototype around the solution for how do we get physicians to get paid by the customers that they already have. Does this make sense? So a lot of times these interviews we use to validate what we think might be the solution, right, to a problem, and that problem doesn't even exist. We've got to go chase a different problem at this point, right? But we haven't built anything, we saved a lot of time, and now we can go out and see if other people have the same experience. Okay? So the other thing that we have to do is we've got to dig in even deeper. So it's not enough to ask them about the problems, right? Because remember, we're trying to collect information here for sales and marketing and for our entire, business plan and to apply to the Duke Startup Challenge. So we got to find out where they hang out, what do they read, and who influences them, right? Or who recommends products to them. Now this doesn't mean, once again, talking about the product, but you might say, "Hey, you said you've got that problem getting customers to pay you. What's your current solution?" All right? And the doctor might say, "Oh, well, I have my assistant calls a bunch of people every day." Okay, that seems really inefficient, right? Or maybe, this assistant is a decision maker, and so we got to go talk to the assistant later on as a follow-up, right? Or it might say something like, "Well, I read a lot of physicians' journals, and sometimes I read Kiplinger's or TechCrunch." So then you've got a sense of where they hang out, but you've got to create a general case. This is where everybody hangs out. So now that we've conducted these interviews, right, we're going to have a set of results. And what we're going to do with the results is we're going to comb for tasks. Okay? So by combing for tasks, this is basically the verbs that I asked you to go out and search for. Okay, right? You were having the interviews, you were asking them what is it that they do on a day-to-day basis. You weren't siloing their thinking into a particular problem, but just getting a general sense of what they do. So now we're going to comb for tasks. And basically, we're going to categorize the tasks that we hear from people. So one of the things that you might want to do that will make this easier is to ask the interviewee if you can record their voice. A lot of people don't like to be recorded on video, but voice is usually good. Or if they're like, I don't like that, well, since you guys, most of you have partners, make sure there's someone there taking high-quality notes. And when you take the notes, you want to make sure you get some quotes as well. But that's why I say use an audio recorder. And so once you get that, you'll then be able to comb your notes to find out what's an exact task that someone is doing, as opposed to an implied task, which is not necessarily what they're doing, but what they might be doing, right? So an example is every student comes in and we need to check them in. We need to check them in, but it doesn't tell me if they actually check them in or take attendance, right? There's just this implication. Or a third-party task, where in this case, my front desk person checks them in. So the owner doesn't even actually check them in, right? So there might not be the end user of whatever our product might be, right? Or they might have some philosophical views where it says, well, taking attendance should be really fast and easy, right? So at this point, they're kind of giving you a really great indication of maybe their process today isn't that great, they want something simple, and you might be able to build that into your product, right? Or they might have finally a feeling. When all my students are checked in, I know the class is going to run smoothly, right? So they want to accomplish this task, they want their front desk person to do it, and once it's done, they know, hey, their studio is in order. So the reason that we want to get at all these tasks, and I'll explain this in a second, but the next phase is we've got to figure out what the preference and the desire and the expectation is. Okay? So, for example, they might say something like, I don't like asking my students for money when they're at the front desk or when they check in. Okay? So that gives you a sense of, well, this person is kind of finicky about money, or maybe we have to do something to make it so that it's seamless and they don't have to actively go out and ask their students for money. Right? Or they have this desire where they say, I wish my students would just prepay. So I wouldn't even have to deal with that. I wouldn't have to ask them and seem like the bad guy. And then they have an expectation that I think that students will prepay for my classes. Right? So this gets at a level of preference, desire, and expectation. It's kind of the same thing, so I'm going to skip over this. So what's the point of all this, right? Why are we doing this? Well, once again, we're coming back to this idea of validation. We're trying to validate whether our idea, the tasks that the end users that we're going after, match up to what we think might be a problem. Okay, so you might have this thing of what customers do that you want to include in your design or a solution, right? So they might have some tasks that they're doing today, which might seem really mundane, or they might seem like they're not really accomplishing their end goal, whatever their business goal is or whatever their personal goal is. So you might want to do those tasks for them instead, right? Or, when you hear their desires and their feelings and their preferences and expectations, then it characterizes a level of need, right? The studio owner saying, I don't want to ask for money, right, characterizes that, well, they need to make money, they don't want to ask for the money, so how can we help them resolve that issue? So now we're going to match the personas to the tasks. And once again, the reason that we're doing this is because we are trying to design for the most common case, right? So if we say we've got two user segments, an instructor and an owner, and we want to design a general solution, then we won't build things that deal with teachers that teach just at one studio. We'll try to find the three most common cases on this diagram, which is they teach, they take attendance, and they ask for money. Right, so we'll design something around those three use cases. And then we'll start to look for patterns. So in this case, I just wanted to point out what the tasks were and what the preferences were. And the reason that I pointed this out is, I'll get to it in a second, but basically we have what the tasks are that we might want to build a feature around, right? We might say, well, we need to take attendance, so maybe we're going to build a feature that helps these customers take attendance. We know that they're going to inform the students that they're expired. Okay, maybe we need to send out an email or notification. And then we need to take some payments from the students as well, right? So these are three tasks. But they might also have some preferences around this, okay? So they might say something like, well, I really like interacting with my students, so I wish I could interact with them even more. I don't want to have to sit there in front of a computer and do a lot of work. So whatever you can do to make it really easy for me to get all my information in, that would be great. Or they might say something like, I want to teach more. I don't want to waste all of my time doing back office tasks or keeping up to date with all of my information. So what are you going to do that's going to be really seamless? Right? Or they might say something like, well, once again, I'd like my students to prepay. This is a desire that they have. And so we're going to classify all of these tasks and desires into what we think are some actions that we want to help facilitate. So we might want to track attendance for them. We want to inform students about memberships. And we want to be able to take payments. Okay? So these tasks essentially become stories. Who knows what a story is? Have any of you done this in computer science classes?
Not computer science, but the story is like explaining how the user would be working with a particular task that you're envisioning.
Right.
So it's like instead of saying, this is what we need to build, explain in detail how the user would use what you're building.
Right. And so this is another reason why it's important to take stock of what their desires and their preferences are, right? So they might say the story might be like, oh, I need a way for students to prepay so that I don't have to ask them for money when they come to the front desk or to my studio. I can instead interact with them more, and I can get paid on time, and I can also, not spend time doing mundane businessy tasks. Okay, so does this start to make sense of how you talk to customers, get their feedback, formulate an idea, a story, and how that story kind of fits into some end goals? And those end goals match up to the desires and the preferences that each user segment has. Make sense? Okay. So these tasks become stories. So really what you're trying to do is you're trying to take the persona that you created, right, from your interviews. You might have some more nuanced personas. What is it that they're trying to accomplish, right? And it might not be everything, right? You might not want to boil the ocean and give them everything, but there might be one specific task that you want to help them accomplish. And then that task is going to fit into some larger goal. Okay? So, for example, as a yoga studio owner, I'd like to take attendance as students check into class. Okay? And then they might have some bigger goal of, this way I know who's expired, I don't lose money, I can keep track of the students that are coming, etc. Okay? So this is just an example of a story. Or as a yoga instructor, I need to keep track of all the students that I teach privately, so that once again I know how much business I'm getting, who my students are, and able to interact with them. So these are examples of how we do stories. And then of course, now we're going to try to generalize it, right? Because we've got 2 user segments. So in general, these people, these business people, want to keep track of their students' memberships. They want to know who's coming and how often. Okay, so then we might design a feature around this story. Is this starting to make sense? Okay. And then, of course, I want to get paid on time, right, so that I can stay in business. This is the higher level business goal. So why are we doing some of these other features? Well, once again, it's to fit into the business goal that they have. And that's where we have to conduct the interview, is to understand what the end business goal is. It's not enough to just create a feature. It's got to fit into something aspirational, some benefit. Right? So it's not enough for Honda to say, this motorcycle will get you from point A to point B. It's like, yeah, well, so will the Harley Davidson, right? But I'm not going to get on that because I'm not one of those people, right? I want to be a different person. Starting to make sense? Okay. So these stories are what are going to feed into the features that you've actually built. And the features, of course, then end up becoming the implementation of what your product is, right? So have any of you done this before, where you've got a story, create a feature, and then you've got a product at the end? Okay. For comp sci class, I'm guessing. No, for
Work.
okay. Okay, so we'll get into more details about this in the next lecture of how we actually take what the stories are, and then how do we build a product around it, how do we do usability testing. So we'll actually get into some building next time, okay? Since I know all of you are eager to see what this is going to look like, but we need to start by doing the interviews first. Okay? All right, so this is not the right review slide. All right, go up here to review. Okay, so we talked about customer discovery, right? We've talked extensively about customer discovery. We do some market research. We come up with our user segments. And then we've got to go out and actually conduct some interviews, right? So what did we say at the very beginning in terms of what a mental model is? Everybody knows what a mental model is. Yes?
Like understanding people's emotional and like philosophical sort of like landscape, I guess, or like their thoughts about, or like their thought processes.
Okay, and why do we want to do that?
To give us more insight in terms of like how we want to design our product.
Okay.
Like understand the customers.
Okay.
And like the whole experience of what they go through.
Right. So what about the experience?
What do they even need your product if their life matches up with what your product is trying to do?
Sure.
Basically all the things, how they think about your product and how they will use it as what are their mental model of customers.
Okay.
And for marketing and sales, and you want to develop a
Yeah.
persona.
Go ahead, finish.
I just said you want to develop a persona for your sales.
Right. So we want to come back to designing a positioning of this product, so it's not just about the product itself, but how can we help the other departments that are going to spread the word about the product that we're building. Okay. What else? Why else do we create this mental model? Or what else are we thinking about as we're creating the mental model?
Or well, the purpose is to find the cognitive intent, the emotions, and the social and cultural traits of it.
Okay.
But then the benefits of it are confidence in your design, clarity in your direction, and continuity of your strategy, so you can really think long-term what your product's going to move into, what space in their minds.
Okay. And why is the cognitive intent and cultural trait so important?
Essentially, you're using those to create the story to build a product.
Fair enough. Yes, but what else?
You want to validate your idea, like make sure it's
Okay. But what else? Remember we put up that picture of that funny guy?
early adopters.
Right. Comes back to the early adopters, right? They already have some ingrained beliefs about who they are and what they think is cool, and we've got to play off of some of those beliefs and put a lot of that into the product that we're building as well. So this is why the cognitive intent and the social and environmental factors make a difference. Okay, and then we talked about doing customer interviews, right? And what did we say we have to do in terms of customer interviews? Where do we start with customer interviews? Who do we go after?
The early adopters.
Okay, and then what specifically?
We have to ask open questions and ask about their behavioral preferences and behaviors and preferences.
Okay, but before we get to that phase,
Make the survey.
yes, make the survey, right? Make the survey 3 to 5 questions. See if they're even interested before you spend additional time. Okay, and then what are we going to do in the interview process itself?
Don't come in with like an agenda to show your perceived product, but just ask open-ended questions that'll lead them to talk about their state.
Okay, good. What else?
I guess like you should also understand their habits, like where they read, where they socialize online, so you can find good targets people.
Right, and where to find more of them, right? And then what else did we talk about? It's not enough to just talk to these customers, but what else are we looking for? Where else are people hearing about products?
Like what they read.
Right. But who else are they reading, or who else is telling them about products? Right. So who might some influencers be? Who might some experts be that they listen to? And then we talked a little bit, I just hinted about the task versus the implied task, right? Where the task is the person that you're talking to is the person that's actually doing it, but then we talked about implied task. And what did I say about implied task? Yep.
Is that the larger goal of the? No. Never mind.
No.
It may or may not actually occur.
Well, yeah, it may or may not occur, but what else did I say about the early adopter performing that task?
Well, I guess you have to talk to the person who actually performs the task.
Exactly. So the person that's sitting in front of you, right, you might think that they're the ones who are the early adopters. They might just be like, signing the check. But it's somebody completely different that's actually going to be using this product. Okay, this is a really important thing, which I didn't touch too much upon, but I want to highlight. So a lot of times, people will go out and they'll say, oh, I've talked to like 3 people and I'm stuck, and I don't know who else to interview. So what you want to find out is who else is going to be using this product at the company or at the business or their friends, etc. And this is a great way to start to build out more of a network of early adopters. But the other reason this is important is because sometimes those people aren't the ones that are using your end product. It's somebody completely different, in which case you've got to get as close to the end user as possible. So you're going to want to schedule an interview with that person after you do the survey first. Does that make sense? So think about that. That's why we talk about this task versus the implied task. Okay? And then what else about customer interviews? Anything else we covered in terms of conducting the interview? Yeah.
Well, you want to preferably record it and have quotes. Is that what they say?
Right. Now, the other reason that you're going to pull these quotes out is it's actually going to be great material for marketing and sales. Right? A lot of times people are like, wow, we talked about this in one of the earlier lectures, is like, how do you get people to buy your product rather than sell it? It's to actually think like them, and who else to think like them than them, right? So think about capturing some of those quotes. Think about capturing even some of the jargon that they use to put that in. A lot of what we used to do very early on was use like, mindfully manage your business, because that's what those are the words that yoga people use, right? So think about the words that they're using as well as you conduct those interviews. All right, and then what do we want to do as a wrap-up to the interview once we've conducted it?
Well, we want to see if we could do future usability testing.
Sure, yeah, that's a good point. So schedule a follow-up, right? Tell them, hey, I've got assignment, or lab 3 coming up where I've got to do a usability test. So I'm going to give you a call in a couple of weeks with a paper prototype or an interactive prototype to show you, do you have time to do that? Okay? So yeah, it's a really good point to schedule them and keep the momentum going, rather than you call them back 6 months later and they're like, who is this and why are you calling me? Right? So keep the momentum. A lot of times people will be like, no, I'm not interested in doing any further interviews, and then once again, they don't fall into the early adopter camp, but go ahead and keep the momentum going and bring something back for them. Okay, now what are we going to do when we collect all of our results? We conduct all the interview questions.
Make personas and stories.
Okay, make personas and stories, but before we do that, before we jump into personas and stories.
Separate out their wants and desires to start thinking about what features you want them to have.
Right. So we've got to figure out what's the preference level, right? And honestly, have you guys heard of MVP, minimum viable product? So a lot of times, MVPs succeed because they really understand what was the strongest desire, the strongest preference of a customer. And that comes out of these interviews. So if you build the feature that matches up with this strong preference, then you build something that people are interested in. Does that make sense? Okay. So what are we going to do with aside from categorizing them into preferences and desires? What's the next step? Okay, right, we're going to create stories from them. And then what do those stories end up doing for us?
Features.
Okay, they fit into features. Okay, so this is starting to make sense of why we need to conduct the interviews, why we need to kind of sift through the interview content, and then how that's going to lead into the design of the product itself. Okay, I'm going to keep emphasizing this because a lot of times this is where you might have multiple ideas, and they all converge based on what the customer wants, right? So if you come back to me in 2 or 3 weeks and say, oh, we still have like all these problems, well, I'll tell you, well, or ask you the question, well, what was the one problem that the customer had the strongest preference? And it was the most general case. It wasn't just one customer. It was multiple customers. Okay? So think about that. All right, any other questions on this? Is everybody, yes?
Do you always have to do like a pre-interview questionnaire? Because like, couldn't you find out a lot of the time those questions in the interview, and maybe if you give them a questionnaire, they won't like want to continue with the interview? Maybe, I don't know.
Well, I always just err on the side of caution, where sometimes people don't want to do a 60-minute interview.
Oh, wait, the 60-minute interview.
Okay. My interviews are usually 60 minutes. Okay. Sometimes they can be shorter. The other reason that I do this, you want to do the questionnaire, is you might determine that, like the questionnaire that I had was, I wanted to figure out who was using our competitor. Not because I wanted to schedule interviews with them, because I had already determined that that wasn't the path that I wanted to go down, but I wanted to classify those people for later on. So if I decide to build something like hook into them as a third-party vendor, or decide to make the same features and do it better, then I have a group of people that I can go out and reach out to. So don't just think about that qualification questionnaire as these aren't the people I'm going to talk to going forward, right? Or I'm going to talk to going forward, but also who can you go back and talk to in the future if you decide to go a different direction. So that's why I always say keep it 3 to 5 questions. I always ask the question of if they're using a competitor solution, because that means I'm not going to consider them an early adopter, but I might want them to help us out later on. So yeah, and it's a really good test of somebody's endurance, because if they're not willing to take the time to answer an email, then they might not sit through the process of a 30 to 60-minute in-person interview, a usability test, and then, of course, using the prototype, right? So this is another reason. A lot of people ask me, like, how do I get the people motivated to do all of this? Oh, it's to do the qualification questionnaire. Okay, so does everybody feel confident about being able to reach out to people? Yes.
So what if your customers number in the tens as opposed to number in the thousands or tens of thousands? How does that change the dynamic of this interviewing process?
What do you mean?
So sometimes, suppose your company's going after larger companies, where each
Oh,
individual deal is a large deal. Like,
yeah.
I think this is
Okay, so like you're doing an enterprise solution.
Yeah.
Right? Well, that comes back to what I said was, sure, there might only be 10 companies in the market you can sell your product to, but in those 10 companies, there's probably hundreds or thousands of people that are going to use your product, right? So even though you might reach out to a handful of them, you still have a really big base of folks that you've got to go talk to.
Because, I mean, there's a fundamental difference between the people that are using it and
right.
the people that are making that purchase.
Yeah.
And they require completely different arguments in order to convince.
Right.
So how do you bridge the gap between the group that's going to be using it and the group that's making the purchasing decision?
So you send your engineer and product person to talk to the customers, and you send your sales and your marketing and your business people to go talk to the decision makers. Does that make sense? So it shouldn't be a conflict, right? I mean, yes, you do need to go talk to the decision makers, help them understand, but you've also got to talk to the end users, and a lot of times it's those people who also influence back, right? They do have some purchasing power, some decision-making power. They might not be writing the check, but they're certainly going to be like, ugh, this crappy software solution again, I don't want to deal with it. Like, bring us something new. So don't always discount that. And sometimes that can also be an interesting strategy where if someone's not willing to sign a contract with you, a big one, and you still manage to get a bunch of their employees or whatnot, right, then you have an even more powerful story to go in 6 months later and say, look, you didn't want to do this, but we've already got half your employees using our product. So why don't we give you some benefit and sign a longer-term contract or something like that? Does that make sense? Right, good question. Any others? All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I know you all had a lot of apprehensions about conducting interviews and how to reach out to people and formulate your questions and how that translates. So I want to make sure that you all feel confident when you go out there to not only do your lab, but to talk to customers. Okay, and last thing I would say is, you will get some rejections, so just move past it, right? You'll get those people that are like, Duke, right? They're like, customer survey, click, right? Move past it, okay? There's going to be people that will reject you. It's just part of the process. Don't take it personally. All right?